John, thank you very much for that. My mother would be proud. I want to start this evening in my introduction of our keynote speaker by talking to each and every one of you and thanking you for being here. No event 122 years long, held every year, could sustain itself if patrons like you didn't find it important and come. And I thank you for being here this evening. I hope it continues into the future because, as John said, this event is important. In fact, I would suggest to you that this event is known widely because of primarily two things. Number one, it's been often said tonight, but it's longevity. You know, John said earlier that this was the longest Washington Day celebration continually in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, 122 years of anything is impressive, and particularly when it's one day a year, held around his birthday, February 12th, is commendable. And I think it speaks volumes to our values and our culture. If the Creve Coeur Club didn't think this was important, it wouldn't continue to happen. Now, the second reason this event is known widely is because of the quality of the distinguished speakers that this event has attracted over the years. In fact, noted speakers from politics, the military, journalism, business, and other fields have come and spoken to us. And when I went over the list of many of them, and they're in your book today that's at each one of your places, just think. Presidents of the United States have come here and talked to you on this occasion. In fact, Gerald Ford, while he was president, then George H.W. Bush, and Richard Nixon, and even a First Lady, Barbara Bush, thought enough of this event to come, speak to us, Peoria and Peoria regional people, is impressive. Foreign leaders, Vicente Fox of Mexico, Mikhail Gorbachev of the former Soviet Union. Those are impressive outsiders to find this strong enough a magnet to come and celebrate George Washington with us. National journalists, including Barbara Walters, Steve Forbes, and George Will, came and shared their thoughts with us. Military leaders, our own, John Shalashkashvili and Elmo Zumwalt came and talked to us about their life's lessons. And those names that I just mentioned are just a few from that 122 years of speakers that we have had. And tonight is no exception. Carly Fiorina was born in Texas, grew up in New York State and Northern California. She attended high school in London and Ghana, as her father took sabbaticals to teach at universities around the world. She graduated high school in North Carolina. Her father was a professor of law and ultimately became a federal judge in California. Her mother was a noted artist, but elected to be a stay-at-home mom. Now, it is said of all of us that we are what we were when. If you just take that phrase and try to think through it, you might get confused. In other words, our early experiences prepare us for what we accomplish in life. Those multicultural experiences I just shared with you about Carly, along with her formal education, a bachelor's degree from Stanford in history and philosophy, an MBA from the University of Maryland, a bachelor's in science from MIT. All of those prepared her for her success. Carly's experiences span from starting as a secretary of a small 9-employee firm. And from starting at that level, she became a CEO. She moved from nonprofits to profits. And she started her business career and led her to the boardroom as a CEO of a Fortune 50 company. You see, she was the one that broke through the glass ceiling to the C-suite for women. the first one. And women to this day continue to follow that with great success, and it will continue. We saw two ladies stand here today with very responsible positions in their professions, to a degree, thanks to the pioneers, in this case, Carly. When Carly was recruited from AT&T Lucent Technologies to Hewlett-Packard in 1999, that industry was facing the worst technological recession it faced in 25 years. But under her leadership, HP's revenue grew, its investment in innovation tripled, growth quadrupled, and HP became the 11th largest company in the United States, and it was led by a woman. All that is extremely important for us to know. Pam and I came to know Carly and her husband Frank, who is with us this evening as well, several years ago, as she and I were asked at the same time to join the board of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Now, Colonial Williamsburg is known as a great national treasure. Many of you raised your hands today in reference to that. You may not know that it was endowed by the Rockefeller family, but it too faces challenges of change. Changes are sweeping across the world today in this country are not unique just to businesses, not just unique to us. Every organization that operates, Colonial Williamsburg included, is facing change. In fact, Colonial Williamsburg, while being a nonprofit, is a large business. It has a historic area that attracts hundreds of thousands of people a year. It owns and operates 1,000 hotel rooms. It owns and operates 20 restaurants. It has 2 world-class golf courses. It has a business center. It has a spa and a world-class museum. I've watched Carly work in that boardroom as we became known to each other and worked together. And I'm watching her do again what she did at HP, that is motivate people, embrace and institute change, and lead by example. It is truly my honor this evening to introduce a colleague and a friend, Carly Fiorina, to Peoria. Please join me in welcoming her tonight as our keynote speaker of this, the 122nd edition of the Creve Coeur Club's Washington Day Banquet. Carly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. You might want to wait till you hear what I have to say. Thank you so very much. And thank you, Jerry, for your very gracious introduction, and most especially for your invitation to address this illustrious group tonight. I'm truly delighted to be in Peoria. I'm honored to be in your company, and I'm humbled by the accomplished and eloquent speakers who've come before me. As Jerry mentioned, Frank and I came to know Pam and Jerry at Colonial Williamsburg, and we came to know that we shared many things in common, and tonight we actually share something else in common. Jerry just had his knee replaced. Frank just had his shoulder replaced. And so while Pam and I have known for many decades that we are married to supermen, we now know that we have also bionic men. Now, before I go on, since we're talking about Colonial Williamsburg and our board work there, and John mentioned an association with Colonial Williamsburg, I should say that Jerry and John have been sort of working together on your behalf. And so they have asked me to make a very special announcement tonight, which I am delighted to do. And that announcement is that the Art Museum, which truly is world-class, of Colonial Williamsburg, our chief curator there, a wonderful gentleman named Ron Hurst, has confirmed that in 1 year, the Peoria Riverfront Museum will receive on loan a most extraordinary and historic object. This object is what is called a mourning ring. Mourning not as in good morning, but mourning as in mourning at someone's death. A mourning ring which contains, imagine this, interwoven strands of George and Martha Washington's brown and blonde hair. Wow, the real thing. George's hair was clipped from the president's head at his burial by his secretary Tobias Lear. The ring was acquired by Colonial Williamsburg in 1992, and the hair contained inside has been DNA tested and confirmed by the FBI, just in case you wondered, in 1994. Now, it seems strange perhaps to have a ring, a mourning ring with hair, but those rings were common in their day. And the death of President Washington sparked a number of memorial objects ranging from needlework to pictures to prints. And so in February of 2021, the Peoria Riverfront Museum will present an exhibition on the life and culture of George Washington, in which this remarkable object will be featured. And I think John and Jerry deserve your thanks and a warm round of applause. So as you have heard several times tonight, it's quite extraordinary, but people of Peoria and the region have been gathering here for 122 years, continuing a great tradition to honor the humility, courage, foresight, and leadership of George Washington. You may not be aware, but in its early days, this was a stag event, gentlemen only. It stretched for over 6 hours. At some point, women were invited to sit in the gallery above and observe the goings-on below them. Perhaps this is when the evenings grew a bit shorter. And eventually, men and women were seated together at the same table, and this event endures as both an important community and national event. I tell you that very quick story about the Creve Coeur Club Washington Day Banquet because it illustrates, I think, an important truth, which we should remember as we celebrate George Washington. Men and women are always products of our own times. We are influenced by the current customs and cultures, and yet change does happen. And so often what was once feared as new and threatening is seen over time as progress and improvement. As Jerry told you, I was a history and philosophy major in college. This is why I had to begin as a secretary. Honestly, history and philosophy were not viewed as employable skills unless teaching was your chosen path, particularly when possessed by a young woman graduating in the middle of a very deep recession. And yet, I have come to view the study of history and philosophy as vital to my own ability to understand and navigate through life. One of the things you learn by studying history is that human nature does not change. Pride, greed, envy, anger, the lust for power, the gluttony of always wanting more, weariness and passivity, even when confronted by the necessity for action. These are immutable aspects of our nature. Just as immutable are humility, courage, forbearance, forgiveness, empathy, collaboration with others and sacrifice for others, devotion to duty and leadership. And perhaps the strongest aspect of human nature is our ability to learn and grow and change. You've heard the old saying, experience is the best teacher. And it is true that we learn through our own trial and error, our own mistakes and triumphs. We also learn by observing others and doing or perhaps not doing what they do. The philosopher Plato observed that ideals and principles feel abstract because we cannot touch them, or talk with them, or observe them. Against the bright colors and the loud noises and the immediate demands and the enticing distractions, and Lord knows in this day and age there are immediate demands and enticing distractions all around us. Against all that the real world has to offer, ideals and principles may seem as faint and silent and far away as flickering shadows cast by firelight on the distant walls of a vast cave. This was the analogy that Plato used, and yet, Plato said, ideals and principles are real and powerful, and history proves him right. From history, we learn that experience can be shaped by principles, that ideals can inspire a wholly new and different experience. In other words, history proves that ideas, the people who champion them, and those that live them, can change the world. This is the story of Christianity, of the Renaissance, the Reformation, many revolutions, ours included, and the creation of the United States of America. America, our founding and our founders, is a unique story in all the world. It is a story of the interplay between the difficult realities and the practical experiences of building a new world on a new continent and the inspiration of a few simple, profound ideas. It is a story that has changed and inspired the world. History isn't fashionable these days. We don't regard it as an essential element of education anymore. Partly, honestly, this is our own fault. We too often romanticize history, confusing nostalgia for the real thing. Faced with both real horrors and real heroism, often occurring at the same time and in the same place, we are tempted to simplify the past and tell just a part of the story. Or we cherry pick our history and we focus only on those aspects that serve a particular rhetorical purpose or political purpose. Too often we overlook the all too human frailties and flaws of historic figures, or forget that they were products of their time. And in so doing, we place them on a lofty pedestal that renders them both unhuman and unreal. And while this may teach us to respect and admire them, we cannot hope to emulate what is so far out of reach. And so perhaps we do not learn what we should from them. Eventually, of course, the fuller, more complicated, perhaps less flattering story emerges. And then we grow disappointed, or worse, cynical. Too often we leave out so many of the difficult truths of the times and ignore for too long those who suffered most. And this creates resentment, or a desire to rewrite history, or a decision to ignore it altogether. And this is a great loss. The story of our founding and our first founder have long suffered, honestly, from too much nostalgia and oversimplification, too tall pedestals, and not enough tough truth. And so, now, today, too many people wonder what we could possibly learn from George Washington today, or why his long ago times matter so much. It is not my intention here tonight to retell the history you know so well, or certainly not to topple our national hero. Rather, I want to speak tonight of what we can learn from the full humanity of George Washington and his tumultuous, consequential times that apply to each one of us for this day and for every tomorrow. So let us begin with the times in which Washington lived and led. The first colonists came to Virginia about 100 years before Washington was born. Our beginning was not so romantic, honestly. The English monarchy was concerned by the economic success of the Spaniards in exploiting the New World to the south and the incursion of the French to the north, and they decided it was time to catch up. And so the Crown granted to the Virginia Company a charter to explore the New World. After a few years of complete, abysmal failure, the Virginia Company asked for a new charter. They had realized that people actually living in the New World of Virginia were in a better position to choose the best course of action than people who sat an ocean and a world away. The company wanted local lines of authority and local decision-making. At first, this meant the installment of an all-powerful local governor. He had absolute, unquestioned authority over every aspect of daily life, and his decisions were described as moral, martial, and divine laws. Tobacco was introduced, and this cash crop became profitable, but still the first colony wasn't seen as a particularly good investment. Potential colonists and investors saw a better future in places like Bermuda or the West Indies. The promise of a harsh life governed by a harsh governor with harsh laws wasn't very appealing. And so to compete and succeed, the Virginia Company needed an overhaul. A new charter was introduced, which greatly reduced the power of the governor and created a General Assembly whose members, the burgesses, would be elected by the people, represent the people, and make decisions and enact laws on their behalf. George Washington would become a burgess in his own time. For the first time ever, anywhere, property ownership, which was the path to wealth, for the first time, property ownership could be purchased and earned, not simply inherited. Economic necessity, the imperative to compete against other colonies for investment, forced political and economic freedoms. To achieve economic gain, power had to be relinquished and risks had to be taken. Representative democracy and entrepreneurship, foundations upon which our nation would be built and upon which our continued strength and wealth of a nation as a nation depend. Representative democracy and entrepreneurship grew out of a recognition that economic growth required people to have a stake in their own future. Of course, economic success required one other critical element: cheap, plentiful labor for the labor-intensive and increasingly lucrative tobacco crops. Slavery, the shame of our nation, built a great deal of the wealth of our nation and entwined itself in our social fabric. Early in our history, sadly, we began to institutionalize the idea that some are more human than others. What did George Washington learn from this, his own history? First, he learned that decision-making far away in England didn't work very well. It didn't work in Jamestown, and it didn't work in the colonies in Washington's time when he served as a burgess over a century later. Washington and many of his contemporaries initially did not want to leave the crown. They certainly did not contemplate creating a new nation through armed conflict and revolution. In fact, Washington himself was adamantly opposed. But as time went on, he joined with others who chafed under the yoke of faraway, misguided decision-making. They understood future growth and prosperity required greater autonomy. Here we are in 2020, and the fundamental lesson is still the same. People closest to the problem know best how to solve it. This seems so obvious, but we so often forget it. Whenever I have encountered a festering problem or an unrealized opportunity, whether in a team, a business, or a community, I have always begun by asking the people who are closest to it and therefore know it best. And whether or not these locals have the requisite titles or positions or power, they always have a good idea about how to make things better. People have often asked me, how did you go from secretary to be a CEO? And the truth is, I did not have an ambition to become a CEO when I started out. Truthfully, my ambition was simply to keep my job. But everywhere I went, when I joined a vast corporation and I was literally one at the very bottom of 1 million employees, everywhere I went, I saw problems, loads of problems that had been there a long time and that everyone talked about, everyone complained about, but so often no one did anything about. And I started asking my colleagues, what should we do about them? And together we collaborated and we started solving problems. I could tell you so many stories, but I will tell you just one. When I was a young manager, early on in my career, I was managing a group of engineers. I didn't know anything about engineering. I was a medieval history and philosophy major. I neglected to mention I dropped out of law school after 2 months. I didn't know a thing about it. And one day I went to one of my employees, an engineer, quite a bit older than I, not a particularly remarkable man, came to work the same day, same time every day, ate lunch the same time every day, dependable, reliable, but not remarkable, Jim. And I happened to ask Jim one day, Jim, are there problems in your work? Do you think there are problems we should solve? And Jim said, yeah, there are. I won't bore you with the specifics of the problem, but let me say this. Jim identified a problem that no one had ever asked him about before. And I said, okay, we're going to do something about that problem. And a year later, Jim had saved us $300 million. People closest to the problem always know how to make the problem better. It's just we so often fail to ask them. Sadly, instead of asking people who are close to the problem, we so often turn for answers to those with fame or power or wealth or title. Our history reminds us to ask those closer to the ground. They may be smaller and lesser known, but because they are more knowledgeable, they can make a greater impact if they are only given the opportunity. Second, Washington learned that power concentrated is power abused. The power concentrated in the hands of a single governor in the first colony was abused to dictate every aspect of daily life, and so investors went elsewhere. Later, the power concentrated in the hands of a feckless monarch sitting a world away was abused not simply to tax the fruits of the colonists' labor beyond what was reasonable, but also to try and win back so much of the autonomy and self-rule that had been so carefully built and administered. In the modern age, we can convince ourselves that the speed of change and the complexity of our challenges requires us to concentrate power. Sometimes we rationalize that power, if it's only concentrated in the good hands, or the right hands, or the hands we agree with, that it will not be abused and the best outcomes will be achieved. Both business experience and political history teach us otherwise. Pure motives, good intentions, and even promising beginnings cannot change the reality that no group of few people is smart or capable enough to make all the myriad of right decisions on behalf of the many. And the exercise of power, of course, always becomes an end in itself. It is why so often the driving purpose of the powerful becomes self-preservation. Eventually, when the many have grown frustrated enough, they check out, move on, or rebel. Whatever one thinks of the wisdom of the move, this, in a nutshell, is the story of Brexit. Third, people will not achieve their full potential and perform at their best unless they are working for their own benefit, not simply someone else's. Ambition, creativity, energy, hard work are in direct proportion to how much stake someone has in the outcome of their efforts. The early success of the fledgling colonies, the success in Washington's time, was a direct result of the birth of entrepreneurialism. Washington himself was a great entrepreneur. Economists disagree about many things, most things it appears, but they all agree on one thing. When more people participate in an economy because they have a stake in the fruits of their labors, the more economic growth is achieved. Finally, of course, there is a darker lesson from Washington's times. Our own self-interest, particularly our own economic interests, can cause us to fear change. Our willingness to see others as different or inferior or foreign can blind us to their suffering and cause us to ignore what we know to be true. How else can we explain the searing contradiction between the ideals and principles that inspired our founders and the reality that all owned enslaved people? It is not an excuse to acknowledge that our founders were human and were products of their time. People closest to the problem know best how to solve it. They need to be given the opportunity to do so. They need to take advantage of the opportunity when it is presented. But people can make a difference wherever they are. Power concentrated in too few hands for too long is power abused. People need a stake in their own lives to achieve their full potential, and when people apply their best efforts, we all benefit. Everyone. And I have learned this over and over again. Everyone has more potential than they, and perhaps we, realize. We are all human, and therefore flawed. Our fear of loss, of power, wealth, status, way of life, can cause us to look the other way and ignore self-evident truths. These fundamentals have forged our nation. Our Constitution and our Bill of Rights recognize the importance of local decision-making and hence enshrine states' rights, because New York should no more tell Virginia what to do than England should. The federal government was given important, enumerated, but limited powers, so that power concentrated in the nation's capital should not be abused. 3 branches of government were designed to achieve checks on that power and balance between centers of power. They formed a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Entrepreneurialism was born here, and entrepreneurs of all kinds have flourished here. They've built businesses and invented new ones, and people have always come from all over the world to do the same. Immigration and entrepreneurship founded our nation and continue to do so. Learning from their own experience of building a life and a future for themselves, and inspired by the ideas of philosophers like Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and others, immortal words were codified by Washington and his contemporaries, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words did not apply to, and that government did not include, the enslaved peoples or Native Americans or women for almost a century and beyond. And yet, can there be any doubt that the ideals and principles expressed by our founding father and his contemporaries in our Bill of Rights and Constitution shaped and inspired our national experience so that change could come and we could build a more perfect union? We've spoken so far about the wisdom that comes from experience and the inspiration that comes from ideas. However, there is another truth that transcends Washington's time and is true in our own. Leadership is always the catalyst for positive change. Not all leaders are famous or remembered in history, but leaders, whoever and wherever they are, unlock potential in others and change the order of things for the better. It is their purpose. And all leaders share some common characteristics which Washington embodied. First, of course, all leaders are human. George Washington himself grew prosperous as a property owner and a slave owner. While increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of slavery, he only requested at his own death that his slaves be freed upon Martha's death. In other words, he was a product of his times, as are we all, as much as he was a leader in his time. He was human and flawed. He could grow angry and impatient. He could be stubborn and cold. He cut Thomas Jefferson out of his life completely when Jefferson criticized him anonymously in support of Alexander Hamilton. And while he and his wife Martha had a good marriage, he also had a special relationship with the wife of his good friend George, Sally Fairfax. We know this from the letters he wrote her towards the end of his life. He is frequently remembered as a brilliant general, but in truth, his record is one of more losses than victories on the battlefield. Leaders, in other words, are never perfect people with unblemished records of soaring success at every turn. Leaders are human, and they fail. Leaders do, however, always possess courage, the courage to risk when risk is required. They must have the courage to endure criticism, because criticism is always the price of a leader who changes the order of things for the better, and Washington got plenty of criticism in his own time. All leaders have the character to keep going when the going gets tough, and the going always gets tough. Leaders are humble because they understand there are important things bigger than themselves. Leaders draw strength from an unwavering belief in the potential of others to make a difference. They are both wise observers of human nature and able to appeal to the best in each of us. They have empathy. They know that each of us is flawed, and yet each of us is capable of contribution. They are great collaborators because they know they can accomplish more together than alone. George Washington took great risks with the Continental Army when risk was all he had left, even when his army was decimated, diseased, hungry, and hopeless, or perhaps because they were. He realized they would fight for an idea larger than themselves, and he rallied them to crucial victories over the British. He believed in them, and they in him. Among the most remarkable things about Washington's record as a commanding general was his tenacity and his resilience. He had the character to just keep fighting. Lesser leaders would have given up years earlier. Outmanned, outprovisioned, and frequently outmaneuvered, he not only had the strength of character to persevere and inspire his men to do the same, he became inventive and creative, both in his battle tactics and in his use of espionage. He did not stubbornly stick to the same plan, but he would not relinquish his goal. As president, Washington respected the constraints of his position within the three branches of government. He built a strong team around him. He delegated effectively. He collaborated successfully with the legislature. He accepted that debate and disagreement could produce better outcomes as long as everyone shared common goals and principles. And of course, he had the humility to step aside after 2 terms in office, fully understanding that something larger than his own power was at stake in the new young republic. In his final farewell speech to the nation, Washington demonstrated how well he understood human nature and how focused he remained on lifting us up to our higher purpose. I quote, "Citizen by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from any discriminations. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference. One of the expedients of political parties to acquire influence is to misrepresent the opinions and the aims of others. You cannot shield yourself too much against the jealousies and heart burnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. They serve to organize faction. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reign of government. This spirit, unfortunately, I continue to quote, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the descendant's spirit for revenge, is itself a frightful despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. Before I close, allow me to tell you a story, not from our past or Peoria, Illinois, but Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my husband Frank was born. Last fall, Frank and I returned to a family reunion that has been going on for almost 80 years. This multi-generational gathering of descendants from poor Italian immigrants come together to celebrate all the joys and heartaches of the previous year. I have been with these wonderful people for over 30 years. And so it saddened me greatly this past fall to hear the weary resignation and the palpable disappointment in our many conversations. All afternoon, whether the subject was business, religion, or politics, I heard things like, everyone is corrupt anyway. They only care about the money. We'll never know the real story. They will just cover it up. Whether the subject was Wall Street, Boeing, the opioid crisis, Silicon Valley, the church, or the goings-on in Washington, trust and optimism had been replaced by skepticism, even cynicism. Closer to home, they feared that perhaps the best days of their communities had come and gone. When weariness descends into hopelessness, the consequences for our nation are grave. Above all else, America has been powered by optimism and self-reliance, a faith in the future and a belief that an individual, any individual, every individual can make a difference. When our divisions seem more palpable and real than that which binds us together, we risk descending into everything that Washington feared most in 1796. When we always look up to someone else for answers, we risk always being disappointed. As Washington suggested in his farewell address, the only antidote is to remember who we are, where we come from, and what leadership really looks like. We have learned the hard way in this country that people closest to the problem always know best how to solve the problem. And so we must trust that our fellow Americans, whoever and wherever they are, can contribute to the creation of a more perfect union if they are given the opportunity. Let us stop looking to others to solve the problems that are right in front of us. Let us look within ourselves and around us to our neighbors and colleagues. We have learned the hard way that power concentrated is power abused, whether in a corporation, a church, or a government. And so, let us work always for the transparency and critical examination that can force accountability, even when that transparency and examination is uncomfortable or embarrassing or inconvenient. Let us always be wary of those with concentrated power, even when we like them or agree with whomever they are, knowing that human nature will always tend them toward abuse. No one of us is perfect. We have flaws, faults, blind spots, and shortcomings. And yet, we are all created equal, and we all have the capacity for leadership. I have experienced this over and over and over in my life. Everyone has the capacity for courage, for character, for collaboration, and everyone can see, if they choose, possibilities in the circumstances that face them. Through my work, I have met amazing leaders in communities all across this country, people you have never heard of, and I know there are people here in Peoria as well, people who are changing things for the better. In Pittsburgh that fall afternoon, I told my fellow reunion attendees their stories, the stories of amazing leaders all across this country, as an encouragement and to cure them from their pessimism. George Washington is known as a great leader because of his wisdom, his humility, his courage, his character, his forbearance, and his belief in his fellow Americans. Yes, he was a president, and he was a general, and yes, he was first. But we have forgotten many presidents and many generals. It is not, in the end, his titles that impress. It is his example and the positive change he helped bring about. Leaders, Washington, always leaders, are defined by their character and their actions, not their position or their title. Each of us can help solve a problem, especially those right in front of us. All of us can muster the courage and collaboration required to change the order of things for the better. Our history teaches us that lasting change always starts on the ground, in small ways, through the actions of people who only seem extraordinary with the benefit of hindsight, but who rose to the occasion when required. Our whole history and Washington remind us that real victory and progress comes 1 inch at a time, 1 battle at a time, 2 steps forward sometimes, and 3 steps back. But we must remember what we are fighting for and not give in to weariness and resignation. When we fear there is no hope, there always is. When we think there are no answers, there always are. When we believe there are no leaders, we always can find them. Over the long term, character always counts. And so does a belief that we are each filled with enormous potential, God-given potential, to learn and grow and make a positive difference wherever and whoever we are. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here each year to celebrate a special leader and a great nation. Thank you for remembering and reminding others that history does matter. It gives us a mirror into which we look to see ourselves more clearly. And thank you for your warm welcome and gracious attention. Good evening.
Outstanding. Carly, thank you. Thank you for your courage. Jerry Shaheen and I are pleased to send you home with a little token of the esteem of the Creve Coeur Club and tonight's event. But you have to pardon me for a minute while I get it. It's a bust of George Washington, inscribed the 122nd Annual George Washington Banquet keynote speaker, Carly Fiorina. Courage. Just terrific. Just terrific, Carly. Thank you.